Before watching, please press like to support me in producing more stories. This helps in spreading the video and reaching more people. Thank you for your support and enjoy watching. This happened in the autumn of 2018. I've never been much for civilization. The idea of living in a house surrounded by other people, all crammed into their little boxes, made me itch. That's why I packed up what little I owned and moved to the outskirts of the White Mountains in New Hampshire. I built a cabin with my own hands, small but sturdy, nestled deep in the woods where the nearest neighbor was miles away, and the only sounds were the rustle of leaves and the occasional call of a bird. My name is Jack, and I'm a former carpenter, born and raised in Portland, Maine. After a bad breakup and a few too many nights drowning my sorrows in the bottom of a whiskey bottle, I decided it was time for a change. So I bought a plot of land no one else wanted and set to work on my new life. I wasn't running away from my problems. I was just finding a place where they couldn't reach me. Living off the grid isn't for everyone. It's tough, and you need to be prepared for anything. I learned how to hunt, fish, and grow enough food to sustain myself. The winters were the hardest, but I always made it through with enough firewood and preserved food to keep me alive until the thaw. I didn't have much contact with the outside world, and that's how I liked it. It was just me in the wilderness, and that was enough. I'd been out there for about 5 years when things started to go wrong. It was early October, and the leaves had just started to turn. The air was crisp, and the days were getting shorter. I'd spent most of the day chopping wood for the winter, and by the time I was done, I was ready to collapse. My body ached, and my muscles screamed with every movement. But it was a good kind of pain, the kind that lets you know you've earned your rest. As I was finishing up for the day, I noticed something strange. The woods, usually so full of life, had gone silent. The birds had stopped singing, and even the wind seemed to have died down. It was eerie, but I brushed it off as just one of those things that happen in nature. I was wrong. That night I was woken up by a noise outside. At first I thought it was just a raccoon or a fox scavenging for food, but the noise was too loud, too deliberate. It was the sound of something moving through the underbrush, something big. I grabbed my shotgun from under the bed and crept to the window, careful not to make a sound. What I saw made my blood run cold. There, just at the edge of the tree line, was a creature unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was tall, easily 7 feet, and covered in thick matted fur that looked almost black in the moonlight. Its limbs were long and gangly, with joints that bent in ways that didn't seem natural. But it was its head that terrified me the most. It was like a cross between a wolf and a man, with a snout full of sharp teeth and eyes that seemed to glow with an unnatural light. I could see its breath in the cool night air, coming out in short, angry puffs. I watched, frozen in place, as it sniffed the air, its head swiveling back and forth like it was searching for something. For a moment I thought it might have caught my scent, but then it turned and slunk back into the woods, disappearing into the darkness as if it had never been there. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat in the dark, my shotgun clutched in my hands, waiting for the creature to return, but it never did. The next morning I went outside to look for tracks, hoping to convince myself that what I'd seen was just a figment of my imagination. But there they were, massive footprints, unlike anything I'd ever seen before. They were shaped like a human's, but much larger, and the toes were long and clawed, digging deep into the soft earth. I followed the tracks for a while, but they disappeared into the dense underbrush, leaving me with more questions than answers. I tried to go about my day as usual, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I went outside, I felt like there were eyes on me, just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. I started carrying my shotgun with me everywhere, even inside the cabin. I knew it wouldn't be much use if that thing decided to attack, but it was better than nothing. The next few days were a blur of anxiety and fear. I barely slept, and when I did, my dreams were filled with visions of the creature, its glowing eyes staring into my soul. I tried to convince myself that it was just a wild animal, something I could scare off if it came too close, but deep down I knew that wasn't true. This thing wasn't just an animal. It was something else, something I didn't understand. It wasn't until the following Friday that things escalated. I was out gathering firewood when I heard it again, the sound of something moving through the trees. This time it was closer, and I could hear the crunch of leaves underfoot. I turned, shotgun at the ready, and that's when I saw it. The creature was standing about 30 yards away, partially hidden behind a tree. It was watching me, its glowing eyes fixed on mine. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, without warning, it let out a low, guttural sound that sent a shiver down my spine. I didn't think. I just acted. I raised the shotgun and fired. The blast echoed through the trees, and the creature let out a howl of pain. It staggered back, clutching its shoulder where I'd hit it. For a moment I thought I might have scared it off, but then it charged. I barely had time to react. I fired again, hitting it in the chest, but it kept coming, its eyes burning with fury. It was on me in an instant, its claws tearing through my shirt as I fell to the ground. I tried to fight back, but it was too strong, too fast. I felt its hot breath on my face, smelled the stench of its fur, and then everything went black. When I came to, I was lying in a pool of my own blood. My shirt was shredded, and my chest was covered in deep gashes that throbbed with pain. I don't know how long I lay there, but eventually I managed to drag myself back to the cabin. I bandaged myself up as best I could, but I knew I was in bad shape. I had a fever, and the wounds on my chest were already starting to fester. I needed help, but the nearest town was miles away, and I wasn't sure I could make it on my own. That night, as I lay in bed, delirious with fever, I heard it again, the sound of something moving outside. But this time, it was different. It wasn't just one creature. I could hear multiple sets of footsteps, all moving in unison, all heading straight for the cabin. I don't remember much after that. The fever must have taken hold of me because the next thing I knew, I was waking up in a hospital bed. The doctor told me I'd been found by a group of hikers, unconscious and barely alive, with wounds that looked like they'd been made by a wild animal. But I knew better. When I was well enough to leave, I went back to the cabin. I don't know why, I guess I just needed to see it for myself. But when I got there, I found the place in ruins. The door had been ripped off its hinges, and the inside was a mess of broken furniture and claw marks. Whatever had attacked me had come back. And it hadn't been alone. As I stood there looking at the destruction, I couldn't help but think of those glowing eyes, the way they seemed to burn with an intelligence that was more than just animal instinct. I don't know what those things were, but I know they're still out there, somewhere in those woods. The doctor said it was a miracle I survived, but I don't feel lucky. I feel like a man who's been given a second chance at a life he's no longer sure he wants. I don't know what I'm going to do next, but I do know one thing. I'm never going back to those woods. Not as long as I live, but sometimes late at night, when the wind howls and the shadows seem to move, I can't help but wonder if they're out there, watching, waiting. And I know, deep in my bones, that someday, somehow, they'll find me again. Because whatever those creatures are, they're not just animals. They're something more, something ancient, something hungry, and they remember me. The months following my encounter with the creature were a blur of hospital rooms, therapy sessions, and sleepless nights. The physical wounds healed, leaving behind a web of scars across my chest and arms, but the mental scars ran much deeper. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing orbs staring back at me, heard the low growl that seemed to resonate in my very bones. The doctors, of course, didn't believe my story. They nodded sympathetically and spoke in hushed tones about post-traumatic stress and the tricks the mind can play when faced with a near-death experience. But I knew what I had seen, what I had felt. The memory of matted fur and razor-sharp claws was too vivid, too real to be a mere hallucination. I tried to go back to my old life in Portland, but everything had changed. The city that had once felt suffocating now seemed like a haven, its streets and buildings a barrier against the wilderness that had betrayed me. I found an apartment downtown, surrounded by the constant hum of traffic and the chatter of people going about their daily lives. But even here I couldn't escape the feeling of being watched. At night I would sit by the window, staring out at the city lights, my hand wrapped around a glass of whiskey. I had sworn off the stuff after moving to the mountains, but now it was the only thing that could dull the constant fear, the nagging sense that something was coming for me. It was during one of these late-night vigils that I first noticed it. A shadow, darker than the surrounding night, moving with unnatural grace between the parked cars on the street below. For a moment I thought I saw the glint of eyes looking up at my window, and my heart nearly stopped, but when I blinked it was gone. The next day, I convinced myself it had been nothing more than a trick of the light, my paranoid mind seeing threats where none existed. But deep down, I knew better. They had found me. I couldn't stay in Portland. The city that had once felt safe now seemed like a trap, its tall buildings and narrow streets offering too many places for something to hide, to watch, to wait. I packed a bag, threw it in my old truck, and started driving. I had no destination in mind, just an overwhelming need to keep moving. For weeks I crisscrossed the country, never staying in one place for more than a night or two. I slept in cheap motels or in the back of my truck, always with one eye open, always ready to run. But no matter how far I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. It was in a small town in Wyoming that I first saw it again. I had stopped for gas, the sun just dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. As I was filling up the tank, I caught a glimpse of movement at the edge of the tree line across the road. There, half hidden by the lengthening shadows, stood a figure that was unmistakably not human. It was taller than I remembered, its fur matted and tangled with leaves and twigs. But it was the eyes that held me transfixed, glowing with an inner light that seemed to pierce right through me. For a long moment we stared at each other, neither moving. Then slowly, deliberately, it raised a clawed hand and pointed directly at me. The spell broke, and I scrambled into my truck, tires screeching as I peeled out of the gas station. I drove through the night, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, constantly checking the rearview mirror for any sign of pursuit. It was clear now that running wasn't the answer. Whatever these creatures were, they could find me no matter where I went. I needed to understand what I was dealing with, to find a way to fight back. My search for answers led me to some dark places. I scoured the internet for any mention of similar creatures, poring over cryptozoology forums and local legend databases. Most of what I found was clearly fiction, or the ramblings of conspiracy theorists, but here and there I caught glimpses of something that rang true. There were stories from all over the world, spanning centuries, of creatures that walked the line between man and beast. The Native Americans spoke of the Wendigo, a cannibalistic spirit that could possess humans. In Europe there were tales of werewolves and skinwalkers, and in the mountains of Nepal the Yeti was said to stalk unwary travelers. But it was a dusty old book in a second-hand store that finally gave me the lead I needed. Legends of the White Mountains, the cover read, the gilt lettering faded with age. Inside, among stories of haunted caves and ghostly hikers, was an account that made my blood run cold. In the late 1800s, a trapper named Jeremiah Hawkins had ventured deep into the White Mountains, seeking new hunting grounds. He never returned, but his journal was found years later by a search party. The last few entries described encounters with what Hawkins called the forest people, creatures that walked on two legs but were covered in fur, with eyes that glowed in the dark. Hawkins wrote of their incredible strength and speed, of how they seemed to melt into the shadows of the forest. But most chillingly, he spoke of their intelligence, of how they seemed to be studying him as much as he was studying them. The final entry, dated just days before Hawkins disappeared, read, "They are not animals, nor are they men. They are something older, something that remembers a time before we walked these woods, and they do not like that we are here." As I read those words, a chill ran down my spine. It was as if Hawkins was describing exactly what I had experienced over a century later. Whatever these creatures were, they had been in those mountains for a very long time. But the book offered more than just confirmation of what I already knew. It spoke of a man who had dedicated his life to studying these creatures, a professor of anthropology at a small college in New Hampshire. Dr. Elizabeth Carver had spent decades collecting stories and evidence of what she called cryptid hominids in the White Mountains region. It was a long shot, but it was the best lead I had. I pointed my truck east and started the long drive back to New Hampshire, back to where it all began. The campus was quiet when I arrived, the semester having ended a few weeks earlier. Dr. Carver's office was tucked away in a corner of the anthropology building, the door marked with a simple nameplate and years' worth of faded comic strips taped to the wood. I knocked, my heart pounding in my chest. For a long moment there was no response, and I feared I had come all this way for nothing. Then slowly, the door creaked open. Dr. Elizabeth Carver was not what I had expected. She was a small woman, probably in her late 60s, with a shock of white hair and eyes that seemed to sparkle with barely contained excitement. When I told her my story, those eyes grew wide, and she ushered me into her office without another word. The room was a cluttered mess of books, papers, and what looked like plaster casts of large, inhuman footprints. Dr. Carver listened intently as I recounted my experience in the mountains, nodding occasionally and scribbling notes in a worn leather-bound journal. When I finished, she sat back in her chair, a look of wonder on her face. "Mr. Harper," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "do you realize what you've experienced? You're the first person in over 50 years to have a confirmed sighting of what we call Homo sapiens sylvestris, the forest people." Over the next few hours, Dr. Carver shared with me the fruits of her life's work. The creatures I had encountered, she explained, were not some new species, but rather an ancient one. They were a branch of human evolution that had split off millions of years ago, adapting to life in the deep forest while our ancestors moved out onto the savanna. "They're incredibly intelligent," she said, showing me detailed sketches of their anatomy. "Their brains are actually larger than ours in proportion to their body size, but they think differently. Their society, their way of life, it's entirely alien to us." But it was what she said next that truly chilled me to the bone. "They're dying out," she said, her voice tinged with sadness. "As we've expanded, pushed further into their territory, their numbers have dwindled. The ones you encountered, they might be some of the last of their kind." I thought back to the fury I had seen in those glowing eyes, the relentless pursuit across the country. "They're not just going to die out quietly, are they?" I asked. Dr. Carver shook her head. "No, I'm afraid not. They're fighting back the only way they know how, by hunting us." Armed with Dr. Carver's knowledge and a renewed sense of purpose, I made a decision that went against every instinct I had. I was going back to the mountains. Dr. Carver tried to talk me out of it, arguing that it was too dangerous, that we should involve the authorities. But I knew that would only lead to more bloodshed. No, this had to end where it began, between me and them. I spent weeks preparing, gathering supplies, and studying everything Dr. Carver could teach me about the forest people. I learned their habits, their strengths and weaknesses, and finally, on a cool autumn morning much like the one when I had first seen the creature, I set out into the White Mountains. The forest seemed different now. Every shadow held a potential threat, every rustle of leaves a hidden watcher. But I pressed on, deeper and deeper into the wilderness, retracing the steps I had taken all those years ago. It was on the third day that I found the first sign, a marking on a tree, 3 parallel lines carved deep into the bark. Dr. Carver had shown me similar markings in her research. It was a boundary sign, a warning to stay away. I was close. As night fell, I made camp in a small clearing, my back to a rocky outcropping. I didn't light a fire, instead sitting in the growing darkness, waiting. I knew they would come. The attack, when it came, was swift and silent. One moment I was alone, and the next I was surrounded. 3 of them, their fur silvery in the moonlight, their eyes glowing with an inner fire. They were even more terrifying up close, their muscles rippling beneath their pelts, claws gleaming wickedly. But I didn't run. Instead, I slowly reached into my pack and pulled out what I had brought as a peace offering, a bundle of rare herbs that Dr. Carver had told me were prized by the forest people for their medicinal properties. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the largest of the creatures stepped forward. It sniffed at the bundle, then looked at me with those piercing eyes. And in that moment, I saw something I hadn't expected. Intelligence, yes, but also curiosity, and perhaps a glimmer of understanding. Slowly, carefully, I began to speak. I told them of Dr. Carver's research, of how I had come to understand what they were. I spoke of the tragedy of their dwindling numbers, of my regret for the encroachment of my kind into their lands. I don't know if they understood my words, but they seemed to grasp my intent. The tension in the clearing slowly ebbed, and eventually the largest creature reached out and took the bundle of herbs from my hand. What followed was one of the most surreal experiences of my life. For hours we sat in that clearing, human and forest person, in a kind of uneasy truce. They didn't speak, at least not in any way I could understand, but they communicated through gestures and expressions that were at once alien and familiar. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the mountains, the forest people melted back into the shadows of the trees. But before they left, the largest one turned back to me. It pointed at me, then at itself, then swept its arm to encompass the forest around us. The message was clear. This is our home, but perhaps there is room for both of us. I've been back in civilization for a few months now, trying to process everything that happened. Dr. Carver was overjoyed at my account, saying it could revolutionize our understanding of human evolution and the creatures we share this world with. But I find myself drawn back to the mountains more and more. There's a peace there that I can't find anywhere else, a sense of connection to something ancient and profound. I know the forest people are still out there, watching from the shadows. But now, when I feel eyes on me in the darkness, I no longer feel fear. Instead, I feel a strange sort of kinship, a shared understanding between two species that have more in common than either of us realized. The White Mountains hold many secrets, and I've only just begun to scratch the surface. But one thing I know for certain, I'm no longer alone in the wilderness, and somehow that makes all the difference. As I sit here writing these words, I can't help but wonder what the future holds. Will we find a way to coexist with the forest people, to learn from them and perhaps help them survive in a world that's changing faster than ever? Or will they remain a mystery, a legend whispered around campfires and dismissed by those who haven't seen what I've seen? Only time will tell, but one thing's for sure. I'll be here in these mountains, ready to bridge the gap between two worlds. Because sometimes, the greatest discoveries are made not in laboratories or universities, but in the quiet moments between man and nature, in the ancient forests where mysteries still lurk in the shadows. And who knows? Maybe someday if you find yourself in the White Mountains, feeling a prickle on the back of your neck like you're being watched, well, maybe you are. But don't be afraid. Just remember, we're all just trying to find our place in this vast, mysterious world. And sometimes the monsters we fear the most are the ones who have the most to teach us about ourselves. I never thought I'd be telling this story. Part of me still can't believe it happened. But I need to get it out, to put it down in words before the memories fade or twist into something I can no longer trust. My name is Orson Weaver, and this is the account of what happened to me in the backwoods of western Montana in the shadow of Mount Sentinel. I've always been a loner, someone who preferred the company of trees and mountains to the chaos of city life. That's why, 7 years ago, I left my job as a paramedic in Chicago and moved out to the middle of nowhere. I thought I was escaping the horrors of humanity. I had no idea I was walking into something far worse. It was a crisp October afternoon when I first noticed something was off. The air had that sharp, clean scent that only comes with autumn in the mountains, and the trees were a riot of red and gold. I was out chopping firewood, a task I'd done countless times before, when I realized the forest had gone eerily quiet. At first I didn't think much of it. Animals go silent all the time when they sense a predator nearby. But as the minutes ticked by and the silence persisted, a creeping unease began to settle over me. It wasn't just quiet. It was as if all sound had been sucked out of the world, and then came the smell. It hit me like a physical force, a stench so foul it made my eyes water and my stomach heave. It was like rotting meat left in the sun, mixed with something chemical and wrong. I dropped my axe and scanned the tree line, half expecting to see some nightmarish creature emerging from the shadows. But there was nothing. Just the trees, their branches swaying gently in a wind I couldn't feel. I tried to shake off the feeling of dread that had settled over me. I'd been alone too long, I told myself. My mind was playing tricks on me. But as I made my way back to the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, its gaze burning into my back with every step. That night, sleep eluded me. Every creak of the cabin, every whisper of wind through the trees, set my nerves on edge. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that I was being paranoid. It was just past midnight when I heard it, a sound so alien and wrong that it jolted me fully awake. It was a wet, dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled through mud. My heart pounding, I grabbed my rifle and crept to the window. The full moon cast an eerie, silvery light over the clearing. At first I saw nothing out of the ordinary, but then movement caught my eye. Something was moving at the edge of the woods, something big. Against every instinct screaming at me to stay inside, I stepped out onto the porch. The smell hit me immediately, even stronger than before. It was all I could do not to gag. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw it, a deep groove in the earth, leading from the tree line towards my woodpile. Whatever had made it was massive, far larger than any animal native to these woods. I should have gone back inside. I should have barricaded the door and waited for daylight. But curiosity, or maybe some darker impulse, drove me forward. Rifle in hand, I followed the trail into the forest. The woods were different at night. The familiar trees seemed twisted and menacing in the moonlight, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of leaves under my feet and my own ragged breathing. I followed the trail deeper into the forest, the beam of my flashlight dancing over roots and undergrowth. The smell grew stronger with every step until it was all I could do to keep from retching. And then I saw it. At first my mind couldn't process what I was seeing. It was huge, easily twice the size of a grizzly bear, but its proportions were all wrong. Its body was a twisted mass of muscle and matted fur, with patches of raw, oozing flesh visible beneath. Its limbs were too long, ending in claws that looked more like scythes than anything natural. But it was the creature's head that truly paralyzed me with terror. It was elongated, almost wolf-like, but hideously distorted. Its maw was filled with jagged teeth that jutted out at impossible angles, and its eyes, God, its eyes. They were disturbingly human, filled with an intelligence that had no place in a beast. And they were fixed directly on me. For a moment that stretched into eternity, we stared at each other. Then, with a roar that shook the very air, it charged. I'd like to say I reacted with the cool precision of a trained marksman. The truth is, I panicked. I fired wildly, the rifle's kick nearly knocking me off my feet. By some miracle, the first shot hit, tearing a chunk out of the creature's shoulder. But it didn't stop. It didn't even slow down. I kept firing, each shot punctuated by that otherworldly roar. Blood spurted from wounds that would have dropped any normal animal, but this thing just kept coming. It was almost on me when I got lucky. A shot caught it in the head, and it went down in a tangle of limbs, skidding to a halt just feet from where I stood. For a long moment I just stood there, my ears ringing, my body shaking so hard I could barely hold the rifle. The creature twitched and convulsed, each movement sending fresh waves of that horrific stench into the air. And then finally it was still. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the monstrosity at my feet. Time seemed to have lost all meaning. It was only when the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees that I snapped out of my daze. In the harsh light of day, the creature looked even more impossible. Its body was a patchwork of fur, scales, and bare flesh, as if it had been cobbled together from a dozen different animals. Its claws, easily as long as my forearm, glinted wickedly in the morning sun. I knew I couldn't leave it there. Whatever this thing was, I couldn't risk anyone else stumbling across it. With a strength born of desperation and fear, I managed to drag the carcass back to my clearing. That's when I noticed the tracks. There were more of them, leading deeper into the forest. Fresh ones. This thing hadn't been alone. I spent the day in a frenzy of activity, boarding up windows, reinforcing doors, anything I could think of to make my cabin more secure. All the while I kept glancing at the tree line, half expecting to see more of those things emerge at any moment. As night fell, I sat on the porch, rifle in hand, watching and waiting. The carcass of the creature lay where I'd left it, a dark mass in the fading light. I couldn't bring myself to bury it or burn it. Some irrational part of me needed it there as proof that I wasn't going insane. It was just past midnight when I heard it. That same wet, dragging sound that had lured me into the forest the night before. But this time, it wasn't just one. The sound came from all around. a chorus of horror closing in from every direction. They emerged from the trees like nightmares given flesh, dozens of them, each one as twisted and wrong as the one I'd killed, but no two exactly alike. Some were larger, some smaller. Some moved on all fours, while others lumbered along on two legs. But they all shared those same terrifyingly human eyes, and they were all looking directly at me. I'd like to say I faced my end with courage and dignity. The truth is, I was terrified beyond reason. I fired wildly into the mass of writhing bodies, each shot accompanied by a prayer to a god I wasn't sure I believed in anymore. They swarmed over me like a tide of nightmares. Claws tore at my flesh, teeth snapped inches from my face. I fought with everything I had, but it wasn't enough. I felt myself being dragged, torn apart. The last thing I remember before losing consciousness was a blinding light and a sound like the world tearing itself apart. I woke up in the clearing, surrounded by the bodies of those monstrosities. Every single one of them was dead, their corpses already beginning to decay at an impossible rate. I was alive, though I couldn't understand how. My body was covered in wounds that should have been fatal, yet somehow I was breathing. I didn't stick around to question my miraculous survival. I grabbed what I could carry and left that place behind, heading for the nearest town, praying I would find help, or at least someone who would believe my story. But as I write this now, safely ensconced in a hospital bed, I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. Those things, whatever they were, are still out there, waiting, watching, and sometimes in the dead of night, I swear I can still hear that wet, dragging sound coming closer and closer. This happened in the remote wilderness of the Cascade Mountains, where the forests grow thick and the shadows run deep. I never thought I'd be sharing this story, but some experiences demand to be told, no matter how terrifying. My name is Glenn Norris, and for nearly a decade I've been living off the grid in these mountains. I came here seeking solitude, fleeing from a world that had grown too loud, too crowded. Little did I know that in escaping humanity, I would encounter something far worse. I'm not much of a talker, but I'll start with this. I moved out to the sticks because I couldn't stand people anymore. Not in the dramatic, I hate the world way, but more in the I'd rather not have neighbors knocking on my door asking for a cup of sugar way. My cabin is about as far from civilization as you can get without needing to learn how to use a compass. No paved roads, no cell service, and certainly no visitors. The only company I have is a scrappy mutt named Blue, who I found starving by the river a few years back. Blue's a good dog, though he's always been a bit skittish, even for a stray. Can't say I blame him, considering where I found him. That spot by the river's been strange for as long as I can remember, though I never gave it much thought until last night. I've had my fair share of odd experiences out here, hearing noises in the woods at night, finding strange tracks near the cabin, things like that, but none of it ever felt dangerous, until it did. Yesterday started off like any other. I spent the morning chopping wood, the rhythmic thunk of the axe echoing through the trees. The afternoon was dedicated to fixing the temperamental generator that kept my modest electrical needs met. As dusk settled over the forest, painting the sky in deep purples and oranges, I was sitting on my porch enjoying the cool evening air. That's when I heard it. The first scream. It wasn't a human scream. No, it was worse. The kind of sound that makes your insides twist up because every instinct in your body tells you something's horribly wrong. It was primal, ancient, a sound that didn't belong in this world. It started low, almost like a growl, then rose to a piercing shriek that seemed to vibrate the very air around me. Blue heard it too. He bolted under the porch and refused to come out, whining and trembling like I'd never seen before. His eyes were wide with terror, and I swear I could see the whites all around. I grabbed my rifle and a flashlight and headed toward the sound. I'm not one to get scared easily, but I'll admit there was something about that noise that got to me. It came from near the river, the same place I found Blue. As I made my way through the darkening forest, the trees seemed to close in around me, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. The closer I got to the river, the more I felt like I was being watched. Not by something with human eyes, but something that had been around a hell of a lot longer than any of us. The forest was unnervingly quiet, except for the occasional crack of a twig underfoot. Each snap made me jump, my heart racing as I spun around, searching for the source. I stopped at the edge of the river, shining my flashlight around. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing glimpses of the world around me. At first I saw nothing but the usual. A thick wall of trees, their leaves rustling softly in the breeze. The rushing water of the river, normally soothing, now seemed to whisper dark secrets. The darkening sky loomed overhead, stars beginning to peek through the canopy. But then I saw the bodies. They were torn to shreds, their guts spread across the riverbank like some kind of sick offering. The metallic scent of blood hung heavy in the air, mixed with the earthy smell of the forest floor. I've seen predators kill before, but this was different. It wasn't just for food. Something enjoyed this. I could see claw marks raked across the ground, deep furrows in the soft earth. Bits of fur and flesh clung to the nearby bushes, as if whatever had done this had taken its time, savoring the destruction. The bodies themselves were barely recognizable as animals. A deer, maybe, and something smaller, a raccoon or a fox. But it was hard to tell, given how thoroughly they'd been mangled. I heard a rustling behind me, and I whipped around, aiming my flashlight into the trees. My hands were shaking, making the beam of light dance erratically across the forest. That's when I saw it. Standing just beyond the reach of the light was something I'd never seen before. It was about the size of a bear, but that's where the similarities ended. Its fur was matted and patchy in places, revealing sickly grayish skin underneath. Long, muscular limbs ended in claws too big for its body, each one looking sharp enough to slice through bone with ease. Its head was shaped like a wolf's, but twisted, deformed, with a jaw that seemed too large, too full of jagged teeth that jutted out at odd angles. Saliva dripped from its mouth, hissing as it hit the ground. But it was the eyes that truly terrified me. They glowed with an unnatural yellow light, filled with a terrible intelligence that had no place in a wild animal. The way it moved was all wrong. It didn't charge like a bear or stalk like a wolf. It slunk forward almost fluidly, with a terrible intelligence in its movements. Each step was deliberate, calculated, like it knew exactly what I was and how easy it would be to tear me apart. I raised my rifle, but before I could even aim, the thing was gone, vanished into the trees with a speed that didn't make any sense for something that big. The forest seemed to swallow it up, leaving no trace behind. I stood there, hard hammering, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen, but there was no making sense of it. My mind reeled, unable to reconcile the creature's existence with everything I thought I knew about the natural world. I turned back toward the cabin, keeping my rifle ready, and as I walked, I heard it following me. Not close, but just far enough away that I couldn't see it, like it wanted me to know it was there. Twigs snapped behind me, leaves rustled, and occasionally I'd catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. But every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. The forest, once so familiar, now felt alien and hostile. Every shadow held the potential for danger, every sound a possible threat. I quickened my pace, no longer caring about stealth, just wanting to get back to the relative safety of my cabin. I didn't sleep that night. Neither did Blue. The thing stayed outside the cabin, circling, making that same awful sound I'd heard earlier. It was a mix of a howl and a scream, rising and falling in pitch, sometimes so low it was more felt than heard, other times piercing enough to make my ears ring. I could hear its claws scraping against the wooden walls, hear its heavy breathing as it sniffed around, trying to find a way in. The sound seemed to come from all directions at once, as if the creature was everywhere and nowhere. At one point I heard something crash outside like it had knocked over the woodpile, but I wasn't about to go out and check. I stayed in my chair, rifle across my lap, listening to it pace. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind sent a fresh wave of terror through me. Blue huddled against my legs, whimpering softly. His eyes never left the door, and every so often a low growl would rumble in his chest. I don't know which was worse, the moments when we could hear the creature clearly, or the periods of silence when we were straining to hear any sign of its presence. It didn't leave until just before dawn. As the first hints of light began to creep across the sky, the noises outside gradually faded away. But even in their absence, the fear lingered, hanging in the air like a thick fog. By then, the inside of the cabin was a mess, shelves knocked over, my nerves completely shot. Blue wouldn't stop barking, his teeth bared at the door, until the thing was gone. When the sun finally came up, I gathered my courage and stepped outside to survey the damage. The woodpile had been scattered just like I thought, logs strewn across the yard as if they weighed nothing. Deep gouges marked the cabin walls, some of them splintering the thick logs. But what really caught my attention were the tracks. They were deep clawed prints like nothing I'd ever seen before. Each one was easily the size of my head, with long curved claw marks extending from the toes. They sank deep into the soft earth, speaking to the creature's immense weight. And they weren't alone. I followed the tracks away from the cabin, back toward the river. My heart pounded with each step, dreading what I might find. That's when I discovered the bones. They were human, or at least they used to be. There wasn't much left, just a few fragments, gnawed and scattered, but it was enough. A femur here, part of a skull there, all bearing the same terrible claw marks I'd seen on the cabin. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This thing wasn't just killing animals, it was hunting people. I knew I had to get out of there. This was no longer my peaceful retreat from the world. It had become a nightmare. I didn't bother packing much, just my rifle, some food, and whatever else I could grab in a few minutes. My hands shook as I threw things into a bag, constantly glancing out the windows, expecting to see that terrible face peering in at any moment. I loaded up the truck and called Blue, but he wouldn't get in. He just stood there, staring at the woods like he was waiting for something. His hackles were raised, a low growl rumbling in his chest. I couldn't leave him behind, so I ended up dragging him into the cab, locking the doors as soon as we were inside. I floored it down the dirt road, the truck bouncing and skidding as I took the turns too fast. Branches whipped against the windows, and more than once I felt the wheels lose traction on the uneven ground. But I didn't slow down. I couldn't. The whole time I kept looking in the rearview mirror, expecting to see that thing chasing us. But I didn't. It was like it just let us go. Somehow that was almost worse than if it had pursued us. It felt like it was toying with me, letting me think I'd escaped when really it could have taken me any time it wanted. I went straight to the sheriff's office when I got to town. The sudden presence of people, of normalcy, was almost as jarring as the night's events. I must have looked a sight wild-eyed, disheveled, babbling about monsters in the woods. I told them everything I'd seen, showed them the pictures I'd taken of the tracks and the bones. They didn't believe me at first, thought I was some crazy mountain man who'd been alone in the woods too long. I saw the looks they exchanged, the barely concealed smirks. But then they saw the bones, the human bones. That's when they started taking me seriously. The smirks faded, replaced by grim expressions and furrowed brows. They asked me to go over my story again, this time writing everything down. They sent a search party up to the cabin, a mix of deputies and forest rangers. I didn't go with them. I couldn't bear the thought of going back there, of possibly encountering that thing again. So I waited in town, jumping at every sound, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched. Hours later the search party returned. Their faces were puzzled, frustrated. They hadn't found anything. No tracks, no bones, nothing. Just an empty cabin in the woods, showing no signs of the terror I'd experienced. They kept asking if I was sure about what I'd seen. Did I have a history of hallucinations? Had I been drinking, taking any medications? Their questions became more pointed, more skeptical. But I didn't have to be sure. I knew what I saw. The terror was still fresh, the images burned into my mind. The sheriff said they'd keep an eye on the area, but I could tell they didn't really believe me. To them, I was just another person driven a little mad by the solitude of the mountains. They suggested I stay in town for a while, maybe talk to someone about my experiences. But I know better. That thing's still out there, somewhere in the woods, waiting for someone else to wander too far from the safety of town. I dream about it sometimes, those glowing eyes, that terrible howl. I wake up in a cold sweat, convinced it's found me again. I'm telling this story now as a warning. The wilderness holds secrets, ancient and terrible things that we've forgotten or chosen to ignore. We think we've tamed the wild places of the world, but we're wrong. There are things out there, things that see us as nothing more than prey. So if you ever find yourself up near the Cascade Mountains, Do yourself a favor. Stay on the marked trails. Don't go out alone. And whatever you do, stay the hell away from the river, because something's waiting there, something hungry. And next time, it might not let its prey escape. I always felt like I was born in the wrong century. As a kid, I'd daydream about living off the land, far from the cacophony of modern life. Little did I know that my romantic notions would lead me down a path of unimaginable horror. My name is Richard Halstead, and this is my story. A tale I wish I could forget, but one that haunts me every waking moment. It all started 5 years ago when my mother passed away. She left me her old cabin in Aroostook County, Maine. It was tucked away in a remote corner of the state, far from any semblance of civilization. When I first laid eyes on that weathered structure, nestled among towering pines that seemed to scrape the sky, I felt a sense of belonging I'd never experienced before. Without hesitation, I packed up my life in the city and moved to the cabin. The transition was easier than I expected. I took to the rustic lifestyle like a fish to water, spending my days hunting, fishing, and chopping wood. At night, I'd curl up by the fireplace with a good book, the soft glow of a kerosene lamp casting dancing shadows on the walls. For 4 years, it was paradise. I was living my dream, at one with nature, free from the constraints of modern society. But dreams, as I would soon learn, can quickly turn into nightmares. It began subtly, so subtly that I almost missed it. A creaking floorboard here, a rustling in the bushes there. Nothing out of the ordinary for an old cabin in the woods. But then the noises changed. They became deliberate. The first time I truly noticed was on a crisp autumn night. I was in bed, teetering on the edge of sleep, when a thunderous thud shook the cabin. My eyes snapped open, heart racing. My first thought was that a tree had fallen on the roof. I grabbed my flashlight and hurried outside, scanning the area. But there was nothing. No fallen branches, no disturbed earth. Just the silent, looming trees and the vast, star-studded sky above. I tried to shake it off, to convince myself it was just my imagination, but deep down I knew something wasn't right. The noises continued night after night, always after dark, always lasting until just before dawn. They were getting louder, more insistent. The woods that had once been my sanctuary began to feel oppressive, as if they were hiding something sinister just beyond my sight. After weeks of sleepless nights and growing paranoia, I decided I'd had enough. I was going to face whatever was out there head on. I loaded my rifle with the only ammunition I had left, some old .30, 06 cartridges, and positioned myself by the window. The woods were unnaturally quiet that night, no crickets chirping, no owls hooting. It was as if nature itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Around midnight, I heard it. A low, resonant thud followed by a dragging sound. It was coming from the back of the cabin near the woodshed. My pulse quickened as I stood up, rifle clutched tightly in my sweaty palms. I pushed open the creaking door and stepped out into the cool night air. The moon hung low and bloated in the sky, casting long shadows across the clearing. I moved cautiously, sweeping my flashlight in slow arcs, every nerve in my body on high alert. As I rounded the corner of the cabin, I caught a glimpse of something moving near the edge of the woodshed. A dark shape, hunched over, dragging something across the ground. I raised my rifle and aimed the beam of light directly at it. What I saw defied explanation. It looked like a massive boar, but grotesquely distorted. The creature was nearly the size of a bear, with thick, bristling fur that seemed to absorb the light. Its limbs were long and powerful, ending in sharp, clawed hooves that dug into the earth. Its head was low, almost touching the ground, and from its mouth hung the bloody carcass of a deer. I stood there, frozen in terror, as the creature slowly lifted its head. When it turned to look at me, I saw its eyes. Dear God, those eyes. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen. Glassy orbs that reflected the light in unnatural ways, more like the eyes of a deep-sea fish than any land animal. For a moment we just stared at each other. I felt like those eyes were boring into my soul, studying me, deciding what to do next. Then, in a blur of motion, it dropped the deer and charged. Instinct took over. I fired, the recoil slamming into my shoulder. The bullet struck the creature in the chest, but it barely slowed down. I fired again and again, emptying the rifle as the monster bore down on me. Finally, with a blood-curdling shriek, it collapsed to the ground, thrashing violently. I could hear its labored breathing, a wet, gurgling sound that slowly faded into silence. I don't know how long I stood there staring at the creature's body. Minutes? Hours? Time seemed to have lost all meaning. When I finally managed to move, I approached the carcass cautiously, half expecting it to spring back to life. Up close, it was even more horrifying. Its fur was matted with blood and some kind of viscous fluid I couldn't identify. The muscles beneath were unnaturally defined, rippling under the skin in ways that defied biology. And its mouth. God, its mouth was filled with teeth like shards of bone, jagged and uneven. I knew I had to get rid of it. I couldn't risk burning it. Who knows what kind of toxic fumes it might release. So I spent the rest of the night digging a deep hole in the woods far from the cabin. It took hours to make it big enough, and even longer to drag the massive body there and roll it in. As I covered it with dirt, I felt a mix of relief and dread. Relief that it was over, but dread at the realization that something like this could exist. What else might be out there in the woods? For a few days things seemed to return to normal. The oppressive silence lifted, and the familiar sounds of the forest returned. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump. Then, 3 nights after I buried the creature, I heard it again, the dragging sound. At first I thought I was dreaming, but as I lay there in the darkness, the sound grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from the direction of the woodshed. My heart pounding, I grabbed my flashlight and rifle, though I knew the gun was useless without ammunition. I stepped outside, the night air cold against my skin. The dragging sound had stopped, replaced by an awful silence. I moved toward the woodshed, my hands trembling as I pushed open the door. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment I thought it would die. But then the beam steadied, revealing the empty shed. The tarp I had used to cover the creature's body lay in a heap on the ground, torn to shreds. The earth beneath it had been disturbed, as if something had clawed its way out. I turned and ran, not stopping until I was back inside the cabin, the door locked behind me. My mind raced, trying to find a rational explanation, but there was none. The thing I had killed and buried had somehow returned, or something even worse had taken its place. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed up waiting for the sounds to return, but they never did. As the first light of dawn crept through the windows, I made a decision. I couldn't stay here any longer. I packed a bag with essentials, grabbed my useless rifle, and left the cabin behind. As I drove away, I couldn't help but glance back at the woods, half expecting to see that monstrous creature standing there watching me. But there was nothing, just the trees swaying gently in the morning breeze. I've been on the move ever since, never staying in one place for too long. I don't know what that thing was, only that it wasn't natural, and it wasn't alone. There are things out there in the deep woods of Aroostook County that defy explanation, things that shouldn't exist. If you ever find yourself in those parts, I beg you, leave before nightfall. Something is waiting in the darkness, something ancient and hungry, and once it sets its sights on you, it won't stop until it has you. As for me, I'm still running, always looking over my shoulder, always wondering if tonight will be the night I hear that familiar dragging sound again. Because deep down, I know the truth. You can't escape the nightmare. You can only hope to stay one step ahead of it. For months, I drifted from town to town, never staying in one place for more than a few days. I took odd jobs where I could find them, construction, farm handwork, anything that would pay cash and not ask too many questions. But no matter how far I ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being pursued. I'd wake up in cold sweats, the echo of that dragging sound still ringing in my ears. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of something moving just at the edge of my vision, but when I turned to look, there'd be nothing there. Was I going mad? Or was the creature, or something like it, really following me? One night in a rundown motel on the outskirts of a small town in New Hampshire, I hit rock bottom. I sat on the edge of the bed, my father's old revolver in my hand, contemplating ending it all, but as I raised the gun, a thought struck me. If I died, who would warn others about what lurked in those woods? Who would prevent more innocent people from stumbling into that nightmare? I put the gun down. I had to go back. I had to find answers. The drive back to Aroostook County was the longest of my life. Every mile brought back memories I'd tried so hard to suppress. As I crossed the county line, the forest seemed to press in on either side of the road as if trying to swallow me whole. I didn't go directly to the cabin. Instead, I headed to the local library in the nearest town. If there was any information about what I'd encountered, I figured this would be the place to find it. For days, I pored over old newspapers, local history books, and even some folklore collections. Most of it was useless, but then I found something. An old journal, written by a trapper in the late 1800s, described encounters with a creature that sounded eerily similar to what I'd seen. He called it the Wendigo, a creature from Algonquian folklore, a spirit of hunger and winter that possessed humans and turned them into monstrous cannibalistic beasts. But the journal contained something else, a way to potentially stop the creature. The trapper wrote of a ritual, a way to bind the Wendigo spirit. It seemed far-fetched, but at this point, I was willing to try anything. Armed with the knowledge from the journal and supplies gathered from a local occult shop, the owner gave me a strange look, but money is money. I made my way back to the cabin. The place was exactly as I'd left it, seeming almost untouched by time. I spent the day preparing, drawing symbols on the floor with chalk, arranging candles, and mixing herbs according to the journal's instructions. As night fell, I took my position in the center of the ritual circle and began to chant the words I'd memorized. At first, nothing happened. Then as the moon rose high in the sky, I heard it. The dragging sound. It was coming closer, faster than before. The candles flickered, and a cold wind whipped through the cabin, despite all the windows being closed. And then I saw it. The creature, the Wendigo, burst through the door, its eyes blazing with hunger and hate. But as it crossed the threshold of the ritual circle, it let out a shriek that shook the very foundations of the cabin. The creature writhed and thrashed as if fighting against invisible bonds. I continued the chant, my voice growing hoarse, my body trembling with fear and exertion. The Wendigo's form seemed to blur and shift, sometimes appearing as the boar-like monster I'd first encountered, sometimes as a gaunt humanoid figure with antlers sprouting from its skull. As I spoke the final words of the ritual, there was a blinding flash of light. When my vision cleared, the creature was gone. In its place was a small dark object, a stone, smooth and black as night. I approached the stone cautiously, half expecting it to explode into life at any moment. But it remained inert. According to the journal, the ritual had bound the Wendigo spirit into this stone. As long as the stone remained intact, the creature would be trapped. But I knew it wasn't over. The journal had spoken of other Wendigos, other spirits of hunger waiting to possess the unwary. And who knew what other horrors lurked in the deep woods of the world just waiting to be discovered. I couldn't destroy the stone that might release the spirit. Instead, I built a small, secure box lined with symbols of warding and protection. I placed the stone inside and sealed it tight. Then I did the only thing I could think of. I went public. I told my story to newspapers, to podcasts, to anyone who would listen. Most people thought I was crazy, of course, but a few believed. And if even one person was warned away from the dangers lurking in those woods, it would be worth it. I still live a nomadic life, never staying in one place for too long. But now I have a purpose. I travel the country, investigating reports of strange creatures, warning people about the dangers that most of society refuses to acknowledge. And always, I keep that box close. A reminder of the nightmare I lived through, and a warning of the thin line that separates our safe, mundane world from the horrors that lurk just out of sight. So if you're ever in the deep woods, and you hear a strange sound in the night, a heavy, dragging noise that sets your teeth on edge, don't ignore it. Don't try to rationalize it away. Run. Run as fast and as far as you can, because once the hunger of the Wendigo is focused on you, it will never truly let you go. packed up my life in the city. I didn't expect to find myself on the edge of insanity in the middle of nowhere. But here I am, a man who used to fix computers for a living, now living off the grid in a tiny cabin nestled deep in the Oregon wilderness. My name is Carter Red, and after my divorce 3 years ago, I needed a drastic change. The concrete jungle had nothing left for me. No family, no friends, just the hollow echo of a life I no longer recognized. It all started innocently enough. I sold everything I owned, cashed out my savings, and bought this patch of land surrounded by towering Douglas firs and an unforgiving landscape. The isolation was therapeutic at first. The crisp mountain air, the symphony of nature, and the simple routine of survival gave me a sense of purpose I'd been lacking. I'm not completely alone out here, though. There's Earl, a grizzled old-timer who lives a few miles up the trail. We don't talk much, just enough to keep the loneliness at bay. I also get the occasional visit from hunters or hikers passing through, but they don't stick around long. And of course, there's Betsy, my faithful hound, who's been my only constant companion. Life out here follows a predictable rhythm. Days blend into weeks, seasons change, and time seems to stand still. But lately something's been off. Betsy's been acting strange, skittish, growling at things I can't see. I chalked it up to wildlife, maybe a cougar or a bear, but now I'm not so sure. The trouble started 3 nights ago. It was close to midnight, and I was stoking the fire in the cabin when I heard something outside, something I couldn't quite place. It wasn't the usual rustling of the underbrush or the hoot of an owl. It was a low, rhythmic thudding, like something heavy was being dragged across the forest floor. Betsy perked up immediately, her ears twitching as she growled at the door. I grabbed my rifle, which I always kept loaded by the door, an old habit from my hunting days, and stepped outside. The night was cold, and the only light came from the waning moon filtering through the branches. The sound had stopped, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. I scanned the tree line, seeing nothing but shadows and silhouettes. Betsy was at my heels, growling deep in her throat. Then I saw it, movement in the distance, just beyond the clearing. A dark shape slithered through the trees, barely visible in the low light. It was massive, easily the size of a grizzly, but it moved with an unnatural fluidity that made my skin crawl. I didn't get a good look at it before it disappeared into the woods, but the way it moved, almost like a snake but far too large, stuck with me. I stood there, frozen, listening to the night, but the only sound was Betsy's low growling and the pounding of my own heart. After what felt like an eternity, I went back inside, bolting the door behind me. I didn't sleep much that night. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind became a potential threat. By morning I had almost convinced myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Almost. The next day I decided to pay Earl a visit. If there was something dangerous out there, I figured he would know. The hike to his place was rough, steep, rocky, and overgrown, but I made it there by midday. Earl's cabin was even more run down than mine, practically leaning to one side. The old man was sitting on his porch, whittling a piece of wood when I arrived. "Carter," he grunted, not looking up from his work. "Earl, you seen anything strange out here lately?" I asked, cutting to the chase. He paused, the knife stilling in his hand. "Strange how?" "Something big, bigger than a bear, moving through the trees." He finally looked up, his eyes narrowing. "You ain't been up to the old logging road, have you?" I frowned. "What's that got to do with anything?" "Just answer the question, boy." "No, I haven't." "Why?" Earl sighed, putting down his knife. "There's something out there, Carter. Something old. The loggers back in the day used to talk about it, called it the skinning beast, said it was cursed." A chill ran through me at his words. "You're not serious." "I'm dead serious. The thing doesn't just kill, it skins them, leaves the bodies out there for the wolves." That's insane, Earl. "They say it looks like a giant snake, but it's got legs like a lizard, and it can move faster than you'd believe. Whatever you saw, you'd best stay away from it." I didn't know what to say. Earl wasn't the type to tell tall tales, but this was something else. I thanked him and headed back to my cabin, my mind racing. I wanted to dismiss his story as the ramblings of an old man, but I couldn't shake the image of that creature moving through the trees. The sun was setting by the time I made it back to my cabin. I double-checked all the locks, made sure my rifle was loaded, and tried to settle in for the night. But sleep wouldn't come. Every sound from the forest seemed amplified, threatening. Around 2 a.m. it started again. The thudding returned, louder this time, closer. It sounded like it was right outside the cabin. Betsy was barking furiously, scratching at the door. I grabbed my rifle and threw open the door, ready to shoot. But there was nothing, just the dark, empty forest. The noise had stopped again, leaving an oppressive silence. I stepped outside, my rifle raised, scanning the area. The moonlight illuminated the clearing, casting long shadows. But nothing moved. Then, just as I was about to lower my gun, I saw it again. A massive, sinuous shape slithering through the trees at the edge of the clearing. It was closer now, and I could see more of it. Earl's description had been spot on. The creature was like a snake, but with thick, powerful legs that propelled it with terrifying speed. Its body was covered in scales that shimmered in the moonlight, and its head was something out of a nightmare. It was elongated, like that of a crocodile, but with a mouth full of razor-sharp teeth that seemed too many to count. It was coming right at me. I fired, the shot echoing through the forest. The creature hissed, an ear-piercing, high-pitched sound that made my ears ring. I fired again, this time hitting it square in the chest. The thing recoiled, but it didn't fall. Instead, it reared up on its hind legs, towering over me, easily twice my height. I thought for sure it was going to lunge at me, tear me to pieces. But then it did something I didn't expect. It turned and fled back into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. I stood there, shaking, my rifle still aimed at the trees. I couldn't believe what had just happened. The creature had taken 2 shots and lived. More than lived. It had practically shrugged them off. I spent the next day fortifying the cabin, barricading the doors and windows and making sure my rifle was fully loaded. I didn't plan on going anywhere until I knew that thing was dead or gone. The sun had just started to set when I heard it again, the thudding slow and deliberate, like it knew exactly where I was. This time I didn't wait for it to come to me. I grabbed my rifle and a flashlight, and with Betsy at my side I headed out into the night following the sound. It led me deeper into the forest, farther than I'd ever gone before. The trees grew thicker, the air colder, and the underbrush more tangled, but I pressed on, the sound growing louder with each step. Finally I broke through the trees into a small clearing, and there it was. The creature lying on the ground, its body twisted in an unnatural angle. Blood pooled around it, dark and sticky in the moonlight. But it wasn't alone. Surrounding it were the remains of several animals, all skinned, their flesh stripped from their bones. And then I saw something that made my blood run cold. Human bones scattered among the animal carcasses. Betsy barked, pulling me out of my stupor. I approached the creature cautiously, my rifle trained on its head. It wasn't moving. The 2 shots from the night before had done more damage than I'd thought. The creature was dead. I stood over it, staring down at the monstrous thing. I should have felt relief, but all I felt was a deep, gnawing unease. Earl had been right. The skinning beast wasn't just a story, it was real, and it had been killing out here for God knows how long. I left the creature where it lay, not wanting to touch it, and made my way back to the cabin. The night was eerily quiet. No sound but the crunch of leaves under my boots and Betsy's panting beside me. When I got back, I didn't bother cleaning the rifle or stoking the fire. I just sat down, staring at the door, waiting for something that never came. The next morning I made the trek back to Earl's place, but when I got there, his cabin was empty. No sign of him anywhere. I searched the area, called out his name, but he was gone. Just like that. I don't know if he left or if the skinning beast had a mate I didn't know about, but I'm not staying to find out. I packed up what little I had and left the cabin for good, heading back to civilization. Whatever that thing was, I wasn't about to face another one. I may be a man who lives off the grid, but I'm not stupid. And now, as I drive away from that cursed place, I can't help but wonder what else is out there hiding in the forests, waiting to be found, or worse, waiting to find us. The city lights are coming into view now, and I should feel relieved. But I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched, that something followed me out of those woods. I keep checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see that monstrous shape slithering along the road behind me. I know one thing for certain. I'll never look at the wilderness the same way again. The peace and solitude I once craved have been replaced by a gnawing fear of what lurks in the shadows. The skinning beast may be dead, but its legacy lives on in my nightmares. As I pull into the first motel I find, I can't help but wonder if I'll ever truly escape what I experienced in those woods. The creature may be gone, but the horror it unleashed will stay with me forever. And in the quietest moments when the world is still, I swear I can still hear that low, rhythmic thudding, coming ever closer.